May 8th, 1945. The ship docked in New York Harbor. I stepped off as a German prisoner of war. What I saw in the next 21 days crossing America by train broke something inside me. I finally understood why we lost. It wasn't the soldiers. It wasn't the generals. It was something we could never compete with, and it terrified me. They loaded us onto modern American trains with soft seats, comfortable, clean, nothing like the cattle cars we'd used to transport people across Europe. On every seat was a glossy brochure, photos inside, concentration camps, the things we'd done. I tried to look away but couldn't. Then I looked out the window as we rolled through Baltimore, Cincinnati, St. Louis. Workers' parking lots filled with thousands of cars. Workers with cars. In Germany, almost no worker owned a car. That's when the thought hit me like a punch to the face. How rich is this country, and what chance did we ever have? My name was Heinrich, though the other prisoners called me Wigwam because of the long coat I wore when I first arrived at the tennis court prison in Speyer. I was 23 years old. I'd fought in Russia for years, seen things no human should see, done things no human should do. And now I was a prisoner, captured in April 1945 as Germany collapsed. The Americans drove us in convoys through France. The jeep I was in had no windshield. The co-driver put his legs on the hood, and I felt the muzzle of his rifle in my back, his finger near the trigger. I wondered what would happen if I fell off at the speed we were going. More than just being run over, I suspected. We arrived at a fenced tennis court in Speyer. Hundreds of us crammed inside. No shelter, just open sky. Then something happened that confused all of us. A truck arrived, loaded with cardboard boxes. We had to queue. Each of us received 2 tins, one labeled K ration, one labeled C ration. Inside, we found meat, biscuits, real ground coffee, powdered milk, sugar, sweets. Real coffee. We hadn't seen real coffee in years, only that terrible ersatz stuff that didn't even foam. We mixed the powder with cold water from the only tap and drank it like that, walking around holding those tins like they were treasure. One of the older prisoners looked at his tin and said something I'll never forget. With food and supplies like this, they could have conquered Europe and the whole world. He was joking, but he wasn't wrong. That night, the temperature dropped. Ground frost covered everything. We'd been given cardboard for bedding. Most guys were freezing, walking around to stay warm. But I had my long wigwam coat. I rolled up in it and slept fine. Thinking about Russia, minus 54 degrees Celsius, the coldest I'd ever felt. This little ground frost? Nothing compared to that. But the cold wasn't the problem anymore. The problem was starting to understand what we'd been fighting against, and it wasn't just soldiers with guns. The next morning, they loaded us onto trucks. American trucks. Big, powerful, driven by black soldiers who drove like maniacs. One truck overturned on the way, rolled down an embankment. We heard the screams, saw prisoners crawling out from underneath like eels, those who could still crawl. What a way to die. surviving the entire war only to die in a truck accident the day after. They took us to a farm near Baumholder, herded us into a large yard with a dung heap in the middle, solid buildings on all four sides. Shortly after, a couple of Americans arrived with spades, ordered about a dozen of us to start digging a trench, 6 feet deep, 6 feet wide, about 20 yards long. The measurements of a perfect mass grave. Everyone in the yard went quiet, except the guards, who kept shouting at us to dig faster. I noticed prisoners gathering near the entrance, tents, ready. I was already measuring up the nearest guard, planning what to do, how to overpower him, take his weapon. Then a truck arrived with drums of chemicals. We thought they were for spreading over corpses. Wooden beams arrived next. We thought gallows. Cold panic spread through everyone like ice water. By the time a German-speaking American with hammers and nails arrived, asking for carpenters, we were all convinced this was the end. He explained he wanted a structure built over the trench, 2 long beams running parallel. The word went around like fire. Scheisshaus, shithouse, a latrine. That's all it was. A toilet. Everyone started laughing, loud, almost hysterical. The guards looked completely confused why their German prisoners suddenly had happy expressions. I saw SS men sitting in a corner, trying to remove the SS insignia from their uniforms, their arrogance completely gone, looking sheepish. I pointed out that their uniforms were a different cloth and color anyway, different cut, easy to identify. They shrugged, probably hoping the Americans didn't know. But they did know, because the SS had their blood group tattooed under their armpits. No one could erase that. German thoroughness had backfired. From there, we went to Stenay in Belgium, a garrison town. They unloaded us onto a broad meadow behind old Napoleonic barracks. Large, round tents stood on the field. They ordered 20 of us into each tent. The ground was covered with large boulders, sharp, uncomfortable. We tried to move them out. The guards stopped us. We complained. They laughed. We spent several horrible nights there. None of us could stretch out. We either curled around the boulders or sat on them all night. Nobody was allowed outside except for the toilet. We heard the guards laughing at us through the canvas. Then they marched us to the railway station. A long train of open coal wagons waited behind a steam engine. They lined us up and gave us one last warning. Throw away all weapons, pistols, knives, sticks, bottles, pieces of metal. I had a bottle of water hidden under my coat. After the warning, they did spot checks. A big burly American came straight for me, probably intrigued by the size of my coat. He patted me down, found my bottle. He gave me one massive blow to my face that sent me spinning into the dust. Blood ran from my mouth and nose. My immediate reaction was wild fury, the urge to hit back. But when I turned in the dust and saw the legs of other Americans moving toward me with machine pistols ready, I cooled down very quickly. One wrong move and I was dead. I slowly picked myself up, wiping the blood off my face. Some of my fellow prisoners were angry at me. accused me of creating a dangerous provocation that could have gotten them all killed. I said nothing, just took my place in line. They loaded 40 to 50 of us into each open coal wagon. Only enough space for some to sit. Most had to stand. Everything we touched was covered in coal dust. The journey lasted about 2 days, took us through industrial regions of northern France. Not once were we allowed off the wagons. We got drenched from rain, coal dust from the wagons mixed with fire and ashes from the engine. We looked like painted gollywogs. The whites of our eyes turned pinkish from constantly rubbing them, and the toilet situation became acute. We had no facilities, so we filled our food tins, and when we came to crossings where crowds waited to jeer at us, we emptied the contents over them. Their jeers turned to furious howls when they realized what they'd been covered with. They picked up everything they could and bombarded the innocent guys riding at the end of the train who had no idea what they were being punished for. At Cherbourg, we were unloaded at the main station. Our platform was barricaded off. The sun was shining warmly. Our marching column was protected by an American cordon on each side. It didn't take long for trouble. The townspeople, recently under German occupation, realized the boot was on the other foot now. They decided to make the most of it. The jeering didn't hurt much, but the hard objects they threw at us did. I was hit by something on the back of my head. Then one young Frenchman made a terrible mistake. He broke through the American cordon. Must have thought he could freely lash out at anyone and get away with it. He was wrong. He was pulled into our column. In barely seconds, while the Americans were helpless to intervene, bare fists settled the matter. When he was finally dragged away, blood on the cobblestones told the story. In a way, I look at that as my last action of the war. The camp was on top of the cliffs overlooking the English Channel. On our way, we passed several deserted Atlantic wall bunkers. Next to me walked an old sergeant who'd defended them on D-Day. He told me about the murderous bombardment, the masses of ships that suddenly appeared in the morning, the chaos, the fear, the death. You could still see battle scars on the bunkers, but nature had been kind. Fresh green growth was covering them. There was a refreshing soft breeze blowing from the sea. Everything seemed so peaceful. The camp was divided into several cages, separated by high fences and rolls of barbed wire. About 20 large tents in each cage. Each took about 100 of us. We slept on the ground, but had ample cardboard to protect us from the damp and cold earth. Between the 2 rows of tents was open ground where we played football and other games, chess competitions, card games, lectures on all sorts of subjects. The food was excellent, probably the same as our captors were eating, far better than we'd received in our own army. Each of us got an American mess tin, which we had to rinse in special chemicals before and after using. The Americans were very particular about health. Toilet and washing facilities were in a tent of their own. Medical attention was available for all who asked. They tried to delouse us. Big, burly Americans, probably with sadistic tendencies, volunteered for the job. They filled thick-barreled pumps with white floury powder, pressure-pumped it into our flies, down our backs and fronts, down our trouser legs. The result was awful stinging and coughing. We looked like overworked flour millers. At first there was slight relief, but after a few days, the eggs in the seams of our uniforms hatched again from body warmth. The lice came back with a vengeance. For security reasons, we were issued with spoons only. Even forks were considered too dangerous, but we quickly overcame that. Used stones as hammers and anvils, tore tins apart. Within days, each of us had a complete set of cutlery. Church services happened almost every day. It was the only chance to get out of the cage, so I attended every single one. Didn't matter which religion. After one service, we had a discussion led by a young American priest. He was prepared to forgive us for what we'd done in the war. But when someone suggested we should also pray for our victims in Russia, for those who suffered from our deeds, the priest compared our Eastern campaign to the Crusades, Christianity defending itself against the godless. We'd heard that before. It was exactly the line the Nazis had used to justify our barbaric onslaught on the Russian people. When we reminded the priest of that, he was lost for words. I think it was April 12th when I noticed the stars and stripes at the main gate at half-mast. Roosevelt has died, one of the guards told me, and that bastard Hitler is still among the living. After about 2 weeks, we marched down to the port, loaded onto a ship, given one blanket each. We bedded down in long rows on the iron floor of the holds. The officer in charge didn't like us much. At the far end stood a huge oil drum with sharp edges. It served all 500 or so of us as the only toilet. When it was full to the rim, no arrangement was made to empty it. The contents kept slopping over, creating a hell of a stinking mess until an American Army doctor made an inspection round. We crossed the channel to Southampton, sailed west close to the English coast, joined up with another large number of ships from Bristol. We'd learned at school that slaves were taken from Bristol to America. Now we were lying in the holds to be taken on the same route to work in America. Having skirted Ireland, we combined with another huge convoy from Liverpool. Altogether, we were now far more than 100 ships. Being allowed on deck during daylight, I found everything fascinating. The whole convoy sailed in a zigzag fashion. Destroyers darted everywhere. We watched dolphins and flying fish. After we overcame the first bouts of seasickness, we enjoyed the good food. One evening, the sirens wailed. Ship's bells rang. The crew went into slight panic. We were ordered on deck with our life vests. U-boat alarm. We had to stand at the railings with our army caps on, possibly so we'd be recognized as German soldiers. It struck me as a final swing of irony. Having thought in Russia for years, it could now be my fate to be sunk in an American ship in the middle of the Atlantic by a German U-boat. But shortly after, the sirens howled again. Life returned to normal. We had beautiful sunny days and calm seas, but also very rough days when we found it difficult to walk with our nailed jackboots on iron decks. After 21 days, the call came through that land was in sight. Magic words. We scrambled up the steep iron ladder, saw America rising on the horizon. We were greeted by the Statue of Liberty. We'd all seen photos of it. Having sailed up a stretch of the Hudson River, New York was there. Mighty bridges, enormous skyscrapers, never-ending traffic along the quays. America, we have arrived. What are you going to do with us? We picked up our belongings and walked down the narrow gangway. At the bottom stood an officer with a counting machine. Next to him, someone kept shouting, "Schnell! Schnell!" Coming halfway down, I saw he had a pin in his hand. He poked it into the bottoms of those he could catch. Everyone tried to get past that little fellow as quickly as possible. We heard later that never before had a troop ship been emptied in such record time. How effective a small pin can be. We arrived on May 8, 1945. Having no idea what was happening anywhere, we were surprised when an American shouted to us in the holds that sirens were howling all over New York because Hitler was dead and the war was over. We received the news with a strange, confused feeling. I didn't know whether to feel sad or shout hooray. We didn't even feel like discussing it. The dead weight of the Nazi past was lying heavily on us all. Us younger ones couldn't really imagine a Germany without Hitler. None of us had ever dared say anything adverse about our Führer while he was alive. We couldn't be sure he was really dead anyway. At the quayside, we had to put every single piece of our belongings on the ground. We were thoroughly searched. Since my last payday, I'd carried a wad of Reichsmark notes in my breast pocket. The soldier searching me put them into his own pocket. Our troop train consisted of modern coaching stock. We were surprised by the comfort of the soft seats. On them, we found glossy brochures dealing with German crimes in concentration camps. The photos shocked us. At first, I believed they were fakes, but when I had a second look, I could see they were real. Reminding myself of so many events I'd witnessed in Russia, the sheer enormity of the crime against humanity I had collectively partaken in took clearer shape in my mind. Germany, my Germany, what depth had you fallen to? I found it strange that none of us felt in the mood to discuss what was in the brochures. Leaving the dock area, we saw much seediness, but the outlying districts were more pleasant. We were impressed and surprised by the many cars in factory and other car parks. Workers having cars. We pondered how rich America must be. Workers having cars. We passed through Baltimore, Cincinnati, St. Louis, Oklahoma City, Amarillo, El Paso, all names which had that touch of mystic for us. In Oklahoma, the earth was red. When we crossed the Rockies, pulled and pushed by 3 enormous oil-fired steam engines, we were very impressed. Rolling through the Texas plains, we saw the nodding horses, the oil derricks. Then came the Rio Grande River. To our surprise, it was almost dried out, no more than a trickle. On the other side was Mexico, a neutral country. The fleeting thought occurred to me of jumping, a short run, then freedom. But the train rolled on. There were armed guards on each coach. Having come alive from the steppes of Russia to the Rio Grande, what was the point of risking one's life? After that came the semi-deserts of New Mexico and Arizona with their enormous cactuses, beautifully shaped mountains with distinct layers of sandy rock, often flat on top. All the toilet doors had been removed, so guards could watch our every activity. The windows were shut all the time. During the hot day, the heating was fully on. We sweated like pigs, while it was turned off during cold nights. Traveling somewhere through Texas, a friendly American captain came into our coach. He told us he'd been to Germany before the war and liked it very much. He asked us to sing for him Stille Nacht, the famous German Christmas song. He seemed a nice man, so we tried to please him, but with the sun shining down mercilessly and all of us sweating profusely, we made a croaky start. We found that under the unusual conditions, it was impossible. The captain understood. We arrived at Florence camp in the Arizona desert in the early hours of a cool night in mid-May. Off the train, we were ordered to dump everything we had onto one big heap: uniform, underwear, boots, caps, belts, everything. It was doused with petrol, then set alight. To watch was very hurtful. It was like the cutting of the past from the present in a very dramatic and symbolic way. There I stood in the grace of God, naked, thin, dirty, forlorn in a strange country. All I'd saved was my wristwatch. We lined up at a counter, were issued with underwear, socks, soft leather shoes, an American khaki uniform, all brand new. After all the dirt I'd endured for years, it was impossible to describe the feeling of fresh new clothes on skin. I stepped around, ran a few steps, shrugged my shoulders, bent over, threw my arms about, felt like a being newly reborn. From there, we crossed a dark square and entered a well-lit dining room. On either side were long, clean tables with benches attached. We were asked to sit down. German prisoners appeared from a counter to serve us a full, warm meal. It was one of the loveliest I'd ever tasted. Few of us felt like talking. Someone opposite asked me to kick him so he could be sure he was alive. Afterwards, coffee was brought in from a large can, real creamy milk, sugar, as much as we liked. All this at 3 o'clock in the morning. From there we were escorted into white wooden barracks. The floors creaked. Everything was immaculately clean. The beds were spaciously arranged in rows, had soft mattresses with clean bed linen and eiderdowns. The smell, the feeling, all this for us, the prisoners. I put my head on the clean, soft pillow. There was no conversation, only hushed words, everyone deep in his own thoughts. Someone switched the lights off. I could see beams of white moon playing onto the foot of my bed. There was utter peace. Tired as I was, I wanted to lie there for a while, think. My thoughts went home to my mother. If only she could see me now. I didn't even know how she'd come through the bombings and the end of the war, whether she was even alive. Then my thoughts went back to Russia, without which the whole thought of the war and me lying here in Arizona had no meaning. It was all part of each other. Slowly dropping off into dreamland, I thought of the old man in the hut holding the hand of the little girl, of Anna, of Boris. What was the meaning of my life? We stayed at Florence for a few weeks. In the beginning, I didn't feel well, probably from the injections and unaccustomed heat, but I soon became alive again. We had little to do but eat and sleep. In between, we played football and chess, walked around camp in cool evenings, talked about home. A fair German library had been set up in camp, probably provided by expatriates living in the area. I did a lot of reading. Works by the great philosophers, Kant, Schopenhauer, Hegel, Feuerbach, Nietzsche. I struggled through many, had to admit that because of my insufficient education, I benefited little from their wisdom. Each afternoon, an Arizona sandstorm arrived, blew all around us. When we heard its howling and saw its dust cloud coming from the desert, we quickly shut all windows and doors. It never lasted more than a few minutes, but afterwards everything was covered with a thin layer of dust. On our arrival, the camp already contained several thousand prisoners, most from Rommel's Afrika Korps. Some were resentful toward us, accused us of throwing in the towel after the enemy crossed into the fatherland. I had quarrels with some of them, but having fought in Russia, I could easily stand my ground, conveniently trying not to mention that they themselves had thrown in the towel in Tunisia. They were still living in the clouds, protected by their Nazi blinkers. Although politically there had been a splitting-off process, on the whole the Nazi elements still held sway. Habit, fear, robot-like discipline were the reasons rather than intellectual conviction. Shortly before we arrived, the camp Nazis had hanged a fellow prisoner from a beam in the toilet because he dared to openly speak out against Hitler and fascism. I was shown the place of his execution. It made me rather cautious in what I said. It also went around that American intelligence was not as anti-fascist as it was anti-communist. There had been attempts by them to draw on the expertise of some of our worst war criminals. Generally, SS prisoners had little to fear in America, or, as I later found out, in England. There was general pride amongst the patriots that there had been no rebellion against the government by the people, though the whole country of Germany was occupied by enemy troops. It was argued that it was a sign of our great racial maturity, but I could not agree with that anymore. I thought, though did not dare say it, that the people should have revolted in the face of the crimes which must have been clear to all who had eyes to see. In June, about 1,000 of us went by special train through Texas, along the eastern slopes of the Rockies, through Colorado, into the northern state of Montana. It was a very beautiful journey which took 3 days. Our camp was outside the town of Laurel, by the side of the Yellowstone River, not far from Billings. From the camp, we could see the snow-covered peaks of Yellowstone National Park. Every day we were taken out in working groups to hoe sugar beet plants on huge fields. Many of the farmers in that area were of German descent, still able to speak German. As the handles of our hoes were only a foot long, it was back-breaking work. The sugar company officials who were in charge tried all sorts of tricks to make us work harder. They introduced a 10-day working week, cut our rations. As a result, several of us collapsed on the fields. Only our determination to drastically cut our efficiency restored our rations to normal. Once the hoeing was finished, we were taken on a train journey across Idaho, along the Columbia River, across Oregon with its forests of redwood trees, into central California to a camp near Windsor, not far from Sacramento. The camp was beautifully situated amidst rolling green hills. Our square tents, sleeping 6 on mattress beds, had a table and chairs, very comfortable. The food was excellent in every respect. There was much too much to eat. We worked well, picking hops and fruit in large plantations. With plenty of sport, music, drama, chess, we organized our own recreation, received much help from the American YMCA, for whom I have not lost my gratitude to this day. Whenever there were days we didn't go out to work, there was trouble in camp. We were all young, probably had too much energy. Out of sheer boredom, an older friend named Fisher had a marvelous idea. He wanted to escape. He reasoned that the port of San Francisco wasn't far away. Ships would sail from there to Latin America, where he said we Germans were welcome. Being bored, 3 of us decided to go with him. In our minds, we already saw ourselves crossing the Andes from Chile into the pampas of Argentina, just like that. All Fisher had organized was a pair of wire cutters, which probably gave him the idea in the first place. The night of action arrived. With the American guards asleep, a couple of wires were quickly cut. The 4 of us were in freedom. We walked for 3 or 4 miles. Dawn broke. We decided to lie low and sleep in a hedge. This was a far cry from when I'd slept rough west of Stalingrad 2.5 years earlier. We assured each other what a great feeling it was to be free. Wondered why we hadn't thought about it before. We woke about midday, decided to walk individually to a nearby settlement to find out the general situation. We left our bags in the hedge. Wearing workman's clothes, no one took notice of us strolling around. We all met each other, but gave no sign of recognition. As none of us spoke decent English, I think we were all at a loss at what we were supposed to find out anyway. It was very hot when I arrived back at the hedge. When I parted the branches, there were 2 policemen sitting by our bags. They looked at me quite pleasantly, not even getting up, invited me to sit down and join them. One by one, the others arrived, received the same treatment. One policeman told us that children had found our bags. When they phoned the camp, the guards weren't even sure whether we were missing. When we arrived back in camp, everyone, Germans and Americans, laughed about us. Reporting to the commandant, he didn't even tell us off. Asked us whether we pleaded guilty to having stolen wire cutters and cut 2 strands of wire which was government property. We got 3 days of calaboose for that. The Andes and Argentina had to wait. I saw to it not to get involved with Fisher again. After harvest in California was over, we traveled that same 2-day journey back to Montana, went into camp near the town of Harding. In working parties, we were taken as far as the Canadian border, to the south into Wyoming, to harvest sugar beets. Our camp wasn't far from the Little Bighorn River, where General Custer had made his last disastrous stand. At times, we worked in Red Indian reservations. All of us, having read about Winnetou and Uncas, were rather disappointed at what we thought was obvious degradation of the people. Much drunkenness, bad housing, cleanliness seemed sadly lacking. Once work was done, we traveled back to the Mexican border. Arrived at a small working camp near Casa Grande, a Spanish-looking place right in the wilderness of Arizona. The camp was surrounded by rugged mountains of grotesque shapes, rising out of the flat, dusty plain full of tall cactuses. When Hightower wanted me, he simply shouted, "Henry!" from behind the partition, and I rushed in with, "Yes, Lieutenant." He often wrote rough letters by hand, which I then had to type. I enjoyed work there tremendously. Hated the weekends when I couldn't go into the office. Apart from being his secretary, I also acted as his doorman. It happened sometimes that visitors without appointments objected to being barred from the office by a German prisoner. I handled it all right when it suited me. Whenever there were complaints, Hightower, not to mention the girls, always backed me to the hilt. I worked in the office for about 2 months, regretted it a bit that the two girls were watching each other. They were both fine persons. We came to know each other very well. They helped me greatly. I repaid by covering up for them and taking blame for mistakes they sometimes made. The announcement that we were going to leave Florence camp was a hard blow for me. On my last day, the girls arranged an office party in my honor. Only Hightower and a few others were invited. The desk in the middle was covered with a white tablecloth. On it were cakes the girls had baked for me, glasses, bottles. Hightower, screwing his face a tiny bit at first, did not object. Everyone gave a little speech with a toast. When it came to me, I was hardly able to say anything because I had a great big lump in my throat. But my friends understood, came into my arms to hug me. There were a few embarrassed tears. Hightower again showing no objection. As a final act, I had to hand in my gate permit card. Then both girls took me back to that ugly fence, snuggling lovingly against me. The gate guards didn't like what they saw coming toward them. One was rude, but received a vicious lashing from the girls' tongues. It being a dark night, the guards shone the full power of the searchlight onto our parting scene. Once inside the camp, I walked along the barbed wire, while the girls walked parallel with me on the outside. We laughed, waved, threw kisses, gave all sorts of promises with hope for the future. Oh, how I hated that fence. Once a week, a re-educational meeting took place in the large canteen. Most of us went. Attendance wasn't compulsory. A German-speaking American chairman opened with a short introduction. Then it was mainly up to us to discuss anything of interest or topical. Feelings often ran high in this attempt to introduce us to democratic values. We were encouraged to speak our minds without fear, which wasn't an easy thing for us to do. The war had been over for quite some time now. Critical remarks about our own actions and policies slowly came to the fore. What struck me was that the Nazis always sat at the back of the hall. Though engaged in much heckling, they seldom contributed anything thoughtful. I never liked to stand up under all the eyes and say my part. But when one day an elderly prisoner urged the audience to be realistic and truthful and accept that horrible crimes against humanity had been committed by us, all hell broke loose at the back. Someone saying, "Ah, well, that was war." I raised my arm from sheer excitement, regretted it in an instant, but was called by the American chairman to speak. At first, stuttering a bit, I challenged forcefully that if that was so, then we should think about the origins of war, not accept it unthinkingly. We all knew, I claimed, that a war must have economic, financial, social, and industrial roots. that enormous profits had been made out of it while others paid with their lives, that if we truly wanted to stop another one from breaking out again, then we must look for those roots. There was much hissing from the back, but no one challenged me. When I walked away afterwards, a group of Nazis stopped me, told me in no uncertain terms to shut my stupid trap in the future. Had I not been a member of the camp football team, they would have given me a good hiding there and then. The next trip took us to the Californian Pacific coast. The transport was by road, covered a distance of several hundred miles. While most of us traveled on the backs of lorries, I was lucky, traveled with two of my mates in a jeep driven by a private. After a short while, he simply announced he would change over into another jeep to be with his friend. That I, who had told him I could drive, was to drive this one. A German mate swapped over from the other jeep. The four of us rolled along the smooth American highway. It didn't take long before our convoy of about 100 vehicles lost all cohesion. We were now as good as on our own. I was the only one who could drive, also who could speak English. All I knew was that I was to drive west into California to a place called March Camp. There was busy traffic. Soon we were leaving the flat desert and climbed on a winding road into the beauty of the border mountains. We observed a most marvelous golden sunset. To my surprise, when arriving at the border, there were customs officials. All cars had to stop. The idea was that no one was allowed to take fruit across the border. When our official realized he was dealing with a jeep load of unguarded German POWs, he ordered us to the side and called his superior. They made a few phone calls, scratched their heads, then let us proceed. Like this incident, I found much in America refreshingly uncomplicated, though not always very efficient. It was already pitch dark when we entered the wider Los Angeles region. At one time, we got hopelessly lost. A friendly American directed us in his car to an Army road sign to March Camp. When we finally got there in the early hours, I was deadbeat. All I wanted was to lie down and sleep. The camp was of enormous size, its own airfield, hospital, what seemed like a town of its own. We were several thousand strong. Amongst us were well-known musicians, artists, others. We had our own symphony orchestra, which gave many good performances in a large festival hall, to full houses, including many American servicemen and their families. All the work we were needed for was within the camp, boring. But food and sunshine was plentiful. There were all kinds of sport, especially football. We were getting into peak condition. It troubled us greatly that we'd had no news from Germany whatsoever. None of us. The war had been over for more than a year. We weren't allowed to write. In the summer of 1946, we each received a card issued from the Vatican. We filled them in with our names only, to show we were alive, but none of our relatives ever received them. On top of the card was the heading, Ein Angehöriger des geschlagenen Armee. A member of the beaten army is looking for his relatives. It was only very much later from England that my mother, who had been officially informed I'd gone missing and was probably dead, received my first communication after a dreadful time of worry. At about that time, my war wounds, shrapnel in the leg, caught up with me, caused much pain and high temperature. I was taken to a military hospital, received excellent treatment, all possible care, recuperated after several weeks. With winter at the door, we left sunny California, traveled back to New York, crossing the whole of the North American continent in 3 days. It was cold and damp when we were unloaded at the huge army complex of Camp Shanks. Our stay there lasted for several weeks. Being sure we were now going home, all of us became rather impatient. When finally we walked up the gangway of the troop ship, we were told by the officers that we would be taken to Bremerhaven to be released from captivity. Compared with our westward crossing in convoy, this was almost luxurious. Took only 1 week. Everyone had his own comfortable bunk bed, and to a large extent, the freedom of the ship throughout 24 hours of the day. When we arrived at Liverpool, we naturally assumed it would only be a port of call on our journey. But we were suddenly ordered to take all our belongings and line up on deck. Meanwhile, a number of British personnel came on board. There was friendly handshaking with their American counterparts. We were marched down the gangway, boarded a train which took us through Manchester to Altrincham in Cheshire. The war had been over for well over a year, but when we were marched through the camp gates outside that town, we woke up to the fact that the Americans had sold us like slaves to the British. We 3 were the first to arrive apart from 2 British sergeants who had to arrange material preparations. A couple of long tables, flanked by chairs on either side, had been set up lengthwise in the hut. The windows were high in the bent ceiling. The atmosphere smelling of officialdom gave me a gloomy foreboding. While we were offered tea and biscuits and talked quietly with each other, our nerves were very much on edge. We could hear the humming noise of our 1,000 mates outside. Then, about 5 minutes later, the British delegation arrived. They'd come in a car from outside the camp. All 3 were officers. One, who carried several books under his arm, was a lawyer. Behind them came a girl with a writing block who sat down at the end of the table. It was all a bit overwhelming. We had no books, no writing material, nothing. Not even a prepared plan for anything. The senior officer, a colonel, opened up. They all introduced themselves. We did the same, though they behaved correctly in every way. The whole stark difference of presentation made me feel as if we'd walked into a lion's den. The colonel said something about the weather, trusted we'd had a pleasant Atlantic crossing, mentioned he'd recently been to Germany, that in his view, conditions there were already improving. He asked which of us 3 was the leader. We hadn't even thought about that. Perhaps assuming democratic processes should mean that was unnecessary. While all of us were about 23 or 24 years old, our opposites were much more mature and experienced. As my English was probably slightly better than that of my mates, we decided I should be the leader. "All right, Obergefreiter," said the colonel, looking at me very sternly. "What is it all about?" "Well," I said, "Colonel, the Americans obviously have released us from captivity, but they've done so in the wrong place. This is England and not Germany." "That's right. Thank you for reminding me of it. But what's wrong with it?" "Everything, Colonel. The war is over for more than a year. Not one of us 1,000 men has fought against you British. You just can't take us prisoners like that. It's peacetime now. No one must do that." "Who says so?" "I say so, and we all think so." "And who are you, Obergefreiter? A Metelmann of the German Wehrmacht?" Following that, he scratched his head, screwed up his face as if annoyed, looked over to the lawyer, asking him the legal position of it all. The latter, who had been laughing and seemed somewhat unprepared, cut his cackle short and started looking through one of his thick books. Then he seemed to have a bright idea. "On what, Obergefreiter, do you base your contention?" Of course, I had no idea. Looking at my mates, they didn't seem to have one either. But then I shot out with the only thought I had. Geneva Convention. Right, the lawyer major said, smiling all over his face, realizing probably that I'd walked into the trap good and proper. What section and what article of the convention are you referring to? Well, I was conquered. What was more, I knew it. When I looked at my mates, I saw only empty faces. Well, that's it then, said the colonel. He mumbled something about wasting valuable time for nothing. Directing his gaze at me, he said, "And the next time you make an official complaint to which we are good enough to listen, please prepare it properly. If I were you, Obergefreiter, with your history behind you, I would not mention the Geneva Convention ever again." All I could do was stare back at him in defiance, thought it better to let it be. The meeting was now closed. We all filed out into the sunny morning. The black SS wanted to know, "When are we going home? When are we going home?" My two mates, being crafty buggers, pointed to me to come out with the answer. Afterwards there was howling and shouting, some whistling, some nasty words saying it was all my fault. It was there and then on those steps of the Nissen hut that I decided never again to act as a democratic spokesman for anyone ever again. Soon we were split up. With about 200 or 300, I was put on a train transport south, arrived on a dark night in the town of Romsey in Hampshire, England. The view from the train window had been interesting to observe, especially as we'd come straight from America, with Germany, France, and Russia strong in our minds. In many ways, England was a strange country. That narrow channel of water seemed to have made much difference over the centuries. Almost everything seemed small and old-fashioned. The rows and rows of houses in the towns, with their small backyards and gardens, seemed cramped. The people were friendly enough, but strangely reserved. Life generally had an unhurried flow, so very different from America and the continent of Europe. And yet there was something likable about it all. From Romsey Camp, we worked on farms all over Hampshire and beyond. We'd accepted our fate now, worked hard, caused no trouble. Those who lived out on the farms had very good relations with the farming people. On the whole, were treated very well. From Romsey, I was transferred to an out camp in a beautiful old country house called Hazelhurst, near the village of Corhampton. It did me much psychological good, as it gave me a feeling of freedom I hadn't had for many years. From Hazelhurst, I was transferred to a camp near the small town of Bishop's Waltham, and was employed to work in the garden of a family in the lovely village of West Meon, where I was treated with much understanding and friendliness. It made me especially happy to be with the children, who were always lovingly around me. From Bishop's Waltham, we were taken to a camp just outside Southampton. In 1948, almost 3 years after the war had ended, I was released from captivity. Shortly after, from the age of 18 to 26, probably the most formative years of anyone's life, I had been a soldier and a prisoner. There had been many moments when I wished I'd never been born. Suddenly, I was set free like a bird. Unused to it, I found it difficult at first. In me was a great feeling of guilt, but also anger, frustration, disappointment. How was I to come to terms with all that? A prisoner transport took me back to Germany. My parents were now both dead. Everything we had been destroyed in the bombings. the clothes I stood up in, and the blue American kit bag I carried on my shoulder were my only possessions. What was I now to do with my life? Before I left England, I'd been assured by Colonel Courage, the brewer for whom I had worked as a farm worker, that if I ever wanted to come back to England and work for him, he would welcome me back. Germany irritated me. There was no attempt even to talk about the war. What happened? Why? I had no home. There was much unemployment. I felt lost and alone. When a close relative told me that the defeat of Germany was the fault of people like me who had no faith in the Führer and who had not given their all in the struggle, I had had enough. I took my kit bag and went back to England after only 4 weeks. Working on Colonel Courage's farms near Cheriton and Preston Candover, playing football for the Bentley Village team, I slowly felt I was returning into the circle of humanity. Then the colonel employed a lovely au pair girl from Switzerland. In those peaceful and beautiful surroundings in that Hampshire village, how could we help falling in love? We married in Switzerland in 1952. In 1954, a son was born to us. In 1956, a girl. I started to work as a railway porter at Alton, became a signalman, then stayed on until my recent retirement. My dear wife died in 1980. Looking back now at that 21-day train journey across America in May 1945, I finally understand what broke inside me. It wasn't the comfortable seats, or the good food, or even the clean uniforms they gave us. It was something deeper, something that made me realize the entire war had been pointless from the start. When I saw those parking lots filled with workers' cars, when I watched factories stretching for miles, producing things we couldn't even imagine, when I realized they had so much that they could feed us, their enemies, better than our own army had fed us, that's when I knew we never stood a chance. Not because their soldiers were better, not because their generals were smarter, but because their entire country was a machine we could never compete with. They had wealth we couldn't comprehend, resources we couldn't match, an industrial capacity that made our best efforts look like children playing with toys. I thought about the Eastern Front, the cold, the hunger, the desperation, fighting with equipment that broke down, ammunition that ran out, fuel that never arrived. And all that time, America was on the other side of the world, building thousands of ships, millions of uniforms, feeding millions of soldiers, and still having enough left over to give us, the prisoners, the defeated, food better than we'd ever known. The Germans in Africa, who'd been captured earlier, accused us of giving up too easily. But they didn't understand. They'd been captured in 1943, sent to America when it was still ramping up, still growing. By the time we arrived in 1945, we saw America at full strength, and it was terrifying. I remember that first night in Florence, lying on that clean, soft bed, thinking about Russia, about all the people we'd killed, all the suffering we'd caused. And for what? For a war we could never win? Against a country so rich that even its prisoners lived better than we have as soldiers? The feeling of guilt for what, in a collective way, I'd done to others, especially the people of Russia, lies very heavily on me. Coming to the evening of my life now, I sometimes wonder what it's been. A drama? A tragedy? A crime? Or a comedy? I cannot be quite sure. I have regrets for the suffering I caused others, but no complaints about what others have done to me. Because when you see a country where factory workers own cars, where prisoners are fed better than soldiers, where everything you thought was impossible turns out to be commonplace, you realize something fundamental. You realize that some wars are lost before they even begin. Not on battlefields, but in factories, in farms, in the sheer overwhelming capacity of a nation that had so much it didn't know what to do with it all. Germany thought it was fighting armies. It was actually fighting an economic force of nature. And you can't beat nature. You can only learn from it, or be crushed by it. We chose to be crushed. And looking back at those 21 days crossing America, at those parking lots full of cars, at those endless fields of plenty, at that casual abundance that seemed so normal to them and so impossible to us, I finally understood why. We never stood a chance. We just didn't know it yet. If you want more true stories from the people who lived through history's darkest moments, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. And let me know in the comments section which type of stories you want more. I've got more coming that'll change how you see everything.